When I was in year 7, I started a new school. We moved. When I was in year 7, a guy at school invited me to go to Scouts with him. And I'd never been to Scouts. I didn't know anything about it, but I was brand new at a new school and didn't know anyone. And so I just said yes, and I went along. I can't remember a single thing that happened that night. I can't even tell you how many people were there. I can't tell you anything. All I can remember for that night is that I came away thinking, I don't fit in here. This wasn't a place for me, and I never went back to Scouts. About the same time, my dad took me to the local squash centre to play squash. Now, a bit like Scouts, I didn't know anything about squash. I'd never played it before. I'd never seen a squash court before. I didn't know any of the rules. I didn't know anything. But the guy who owned the squash centre, who was standing behind the counter, was so friendly. He was so kind, and he must I can't remember exactly, I must have asked my dad, and my first time, and he told me and invited me out to a Saturday morning sort of coaching juniors clinic thing they had, and I went to that, and the coach guy who was there was really friendly and really kind, and cut a long story short, I played squash at least twice a week for the next 15 years of my life. We all have stories like that, don't we? There was just something about the way those people welcomed me into that, the hospitality that I felt in that environment that just drew me in. We're in a series that we kind of bounce across the year that we call Who We Are. When we started this church, if you start a church, you've got to ask yourself, what kind of church do you want to be when you say we want to start a church? And so we had lots of conversations, sort of prayerful conversations about the kind of church that we wanted to be, what would be important to us as a church, how we would do things. And we ended up with a sort of a one-sentence headline that we felt sort of captured who we are, and it's on at the wall behind me. It's up every week. It says that we want to be people who are devoted to Jesus, living our lives following Jesus' example and teaching wherever we are, no matter the cost. And we talked about the way we'd get there. If that's kind of the destination, how do we get from here to there? And we said there are 3 things that hopefully you'll see each week in terms of the way we do things. We said that we'll provide an opportunity for people to experience Jesus through worship, through community, and through communion. And we do that. That's kind of the way we organise ourselves on a weekly basis. Number 2, we said that we'll focus on clear, practical Bible teaching and preaching, and that really influences the way that we teach and kind of what I do here. And the 3rd thing we said is that we will empower people to serve our community and our world. And if you've hung around for a bit, we're always talking about the way we're going to do that. And we're just in another kind of exciting moment of working with a Coolock House, a local charity that looks after young women, and talking about something pretty special that we might be able to do in their lives. And finally, we talked about the kind of people that we want to be along this journey. The kind of people that we believe Jesus wants us to be along this journey, because you've heard me say this 1,000 times, and I'm going to say it 1,000 more times, that church isn't an organisation, that church isn't a building, church is a group of people. That you don't go to church, you don't attend a church, you are the church. The people are the church. So it's true to say when we say what kind of church Tide is, we're really saying what kind of people will be. Does that make sense? Because we are the church. Tide Church is us. It's this group of people. It's how we behave. It's the things that we say. It's the things that we do. It's the people that we are. So we asked ourselves, what kind of people do we want to be at Tide Church? And we came up with 6 behaviours that we said that we really hope that these things would define us. We're all different people. We're young, we're old, we're single, we're married, we're all sorts of different hobbies and whatever. But we said we hope that there's 6 sort of underlying, I guess you'd call it sort of foundational things that would be true of everyone who's a part of this place. We came up with 6 individual words. The first word was the word love. We said we want to be people who love God with all we've got and who love one another. The second word we came up with was the word grace. We said we want to be people who are focused on God's grace, God's God's goodness, God's mercy to us. Joy. We said we want to be people who experience joy, and not the joy of our circumstances, not joy like I had a good week, but a much deeper, more real sense of joy that comes from knowing God in our lives on a daily basis. Whatever's going, whether things are going good or things are going bad, there's a deeper sense of joy. We said we want to be people who are about that, right? Generosity. We said we want to be people who are just generous with our time, with our money, with our staff, generous toward one another, generous toward God. We believe that God's been unbelievably generous to us, the things that God's given us. And so our generosity back to God and to others is just a little bit of a way to sort of reflect who God is to us. We talked about faith, number 5. We said we want to be people who believe, deep inside us believe that God, the God that we worship, that we talk about, that we sing about, that our God is active in the world around us. That He's active in our lives, that He can and He does change things, that God really can and does change things in our lives, in our church, and in the world around us. And the final of the 6 words, the 6 behaviours that we hope are really true for us as a church, for us as individuals, are the words hospitality and inclusivity. We said we want to be people who are welcoming and who are friendly to everyone we meet, people inside the church and people outside the church. We want to be the people who take the first step toward others, not wait for someone else to be kind and to be friendly to us. We want to be the people who are first extending kindness and friendliness toward others. Why do we think that this kind of hospitality, this kind of inclusivity is important to us? Because we follow Jesus, and this kind of hospitality was really important to Jesus. Jesus was a rabbi. We don't use that word much, but a rabbi is an ancient Hebrew word that means he was a teacher of the Bible. He was a leader in the God space. I guess it's a little bit like we might use words like, if you've been around church, you might call someone a pastor or a minister or a reverend or, that sort of thing. Jesus was a rabbi. He was one of those guys. But Jesus wasn't like other rabbis. He didn't teach the way that other rabbis taught. He didn't teach the sort of things that other rabbis taught. He didn't live the way other rabbis taught. And he didn't hang out with the kind of people that other rabbis hung out with. Now, in the world that Jesus grew up in, rabbis were really important people. People looked up to rabbis. Rabbis were good people. They were people that did the right things and knew the right things. Everyone kind of wanted to be a rabbi. If you had a daughter, if a daughter married a rabbi, that was, as a good thing. Rabbis were like there. And so actually in our world's a little bit like this too. And so rabbis were good people, so they tended to hang out with other good people, right? Rabbis were good people, so they didn't hang out with people who weren't good. Our world kind of works the same way today, doesn't it? But Jesus lived differently. And time again, Jesus seemed to be hanging out with the wrong kind of people. In fact, Jesus seemed to go out of his way to hang out with the wrong kind of people. It's almost like he was deliberately trying to hang out with the wrong kind of people. And actually, more than that, Jesus didn't just hang out with them. He would go to their house and have dinner with them. He would be friends with them. And I'm not talking once or twice. I'm talking about things that Jesus did consistently, that he did constantly. Let me give you one example. John, who was one of Jesus' disciples, so spent a lot of time with Jesus. When he wrote a biography, when he wrote about the life of Jesus many years after the death and the resurrection of Jesus, he remembers this story. He remembers this moment when Jesus and the disciples were traveling from Judah to Galilee. And along the way, they stop at a well because they need a drink, right? There's no corner store. You can't take things with you. So they stop at a well for a drink. You could read this in John chapter 4 in your Bible. And while they're at the well, Jesus had a conversation with a Samaritan woman, a woman from the area of Samaria. John chapter 4, verse 3, Jesus left Judea and returned to Galilee. He had to go through Samaria on the way. Eventually he came to the Samaritan village of Sychar. And Jesus, this is verse 6, Jesus, tired from a long walk, sat wearily beside the well about noontime. Soon a Samaritan woman came to draw water, and Jesus said to her, "Please give me a drink." Now, that sounds like the most ordinary story in the world to us, right? But if you're in that moment when that happens, this is a completely crazy story. This is the kind of story that never happens. I know to you, you're like, he went for a walk, he stopped for a drink, a woman came along and he had a chat with her. This story is nuts. You see, Jesus is traveling from Judah to Galilee, right? I think there's a map somewhere here. Jesus is traveling from Judah. So this is where he was. Judah's the area that Jerusalem's in, if you've heard of Jerusalem. And he's traveling to Galilee, which is up here, Sea of Galilee, up in this kind of area here. And so normally it's about it's 2.5 day walk, right? This is a serious travel. Remember, there's no Uber, like you can't hop on a train. You've got to walk everywhere. So he and the disciples are traveling from here to here, and they're walking through Samaria, which is this big area in the middle. Now, here's what you need to know about this story. Jews hated Samaritans, right? This is Jewish territory, and this is Jewish territory, and in the middle is Samaria, and Jews hated people who lived in this area. Jews believed that Samaritans were like spiritually dirty, and they would do everything they can to avoid Samaritans. 2.5 day walk if you walk this direction. See this black line? That's the route that a normal Jewish person would take to walk from Galilee to Judea. Do you notice anything? They take a big detour around Samaria here. They would add literally a day or two to their walk just so they didn't have to walk through Samaria and bump into a Samaritan. This whole story in John 4 happens because Jesus didn't take that route. He walked straight through Samaria. Jesus deliberately walks through Samaria and then he stops to chat to someone. Now, if for some reason you had to walk through Samaria, it was like a roll up the windows and lock the doors kind of journey, right? No, but not Jesus. He stops and he has a chat, and who does he have a chat to? He has a chat to a woman. And if you've been around us in the last few weeks, rabbis didn't chat to women. Good people didn't do any of this. Good people didn't walk through Samaria. Good people didn't stop and talk to Samaritans. And good people, and especially rabbis, would definitely not stop and talk to a Samaritan woman. Verse 9 says, the Samaritan, talks about the woman was surprised. This is that Jesus stopped and talked to her. The woman was surprised, for Jews refused to have anything to do with Samaritans. Even the woman thought this whole thing was weird, right? But this is the way Jesus lived. Can you see the point we're making? The Gospels are full of stories like this. Full of stories like this where Jesus goes out of his way to connect with people who everyone else avoided. Jesus hung out with prostitutes. Like real, actual prostitutes, right? Jesus touched lepers. Leprosy was highly contagious and you stayed way away from lepers. Not only did Jesus get close to them, he literally touched them. Jesus travelled through Samaria, and there's lots of stories where Jesus travelled to other kind of non-Jewish places where Jews and rabbis would never go. Jesus taught women and hung out with women. We've talked about that in recent weeks, how significant that was, how different that was. Jesus hung out with the poor. Now, when we say that, I'm not talking poor like that friend of yours who just doesn't have a lot of money. I'm talking in the gutter, smelly, homeless kind of poor. All the kind of people, let's be really honest, all the kind of people that most of us would still not talk to or hang around today, right? The kind of people that if you walk down the street and you saw people like this, prostitutes, leprosy, if you saw people with scabs and sores all over them, you see homeless people, and most of us will still to this day kind of just, walk around them, exactly like the Jews were doing in Samaria, just taking a wander around it. This isn't, the point I'm making, this isn't a coincidence, right? Jesus is up to something here. Jesus is deliberately taking the message of God's love and he's deliberately going and sharing it with people who people of God didn't love, right? Luke tells us in Luke 15, chapter 2, that hanging out with the wrong people became such a feature of Jesus' life that Luke 15:2 says the Pharisees and the teachers of the law, so the other spiritual people, right? The Pharisees and the teachers of the law muttered, talked amongst themselves, and they said, "This man welcomes sinners and eats with them." This actually became a label for Jesus, right? This became the thing where people would talk about Jesus and say, Jesus, he's the guy that hangs out with those people. You know that rabbi Jesus? He's the guy that hangs out with sinners. Yeah, I've heard of that guy. I've heard of that rabbi. This became a label to describe the sort of person he was. Jesus was the guy that hung out with the people that no one else wanted to hang out with. He hung out with people who weren't cool, who weren't accepted, who weren't rich, who weren't good, who weren't pretty, who weren't popular. You add to the list whatever words you want. Jesus deliberately went and hung out with those people. And Jesus set an example that his followers followed. And this same kind of living became part of the way the first church lived. The writers and the leaders of the first church called this hospitality. Hospitality is going out of your way to welcome and to include people, to welcome everyone without any kind of favoritism, without any sort of judgment, without seeing any kind of classes of people. One writer, one sort of Bible expert, defines the word hospitality the way the Bible uses it by saying that hospitality is treating strangers and friends the same. It's welcoming one another into our homes and into our lives. Hospitality in the Bible is an outward action that happens from an inward attitude. Hospitality and inclusivity starts with an inward attitude. It's how we see people. It's what we think about other people when we look at them. It's what we believe about other people in our hearts. Because we all have that. You see someone and you start to think things in your heart about the kind of person that they are. It starts with an inward attitude, but hospitality and inclusivity becomes an outward action. It's about the way that we welcome people. It's about spending time with people. It's about inviting people into our homes and into our lives. And if you want to follow Jesus, you need both this inward hospitality and this outward hospitality. Because hospitality that doesn't begin with our hearts, that doesn't begin with the inward parts. In other words, if we look at other people and we think we're better than them, if we look at other people, if there's some part of it, we look at other people and go, I just don't care for that kind of person. If we don't have the ability to see every person that we meet as someone who was created by God and loved by God exactly the same way that we were created by God and we're loved by God, if we don't have that, if our hearts don't work that way, then anything we do is just like empty rule keeping. Do you know what I mean? You're just doing stuff because someone says, well, you have to do it, but you don't really believe in it. And we all know, because we've all seen this, like people see through that, right? People know when you're just doing something because someone told you have to do it. You've all been in that place where a kid plays with you on the playground because the teacher just told them they have to, right? It's not a fun place to be. I'm just making this phone call because Dad told me I have to. It's horrible. And if hospitality, if it only stays in our heart, if it doesn't become an outward action, in other words, if we can't be bothered turning that inward attitude into an outward action, if it's too awkward or if we're just too busy with our important lives, then actually who cares what's in your heart, right? I mean, it makes no difference what's in your heart if you're not expressing that or showing that or acting that out in a way that impacts the lives of other people. This kind of hospitality, the kind of hospitality that is treating strangers and friends the same, became a key part of the way the church lived differently to the world around it. It became one of the key things that was different about people who were in the church and people who were outside the church, people who believed in God and loved God and followed Jesus, and those who didn't. Paul tells Titus 1 verse 8, be hospitable. Peter tells the church in 1 Peter 4:9, offer hospitality to one another without grumbling. Paul writes to the church in Rome, share with the Lord's people who are in need, practice hospitality, Romans 12:13. The writer of Hebrews says, do not forget to show hospitality to strangers, Hebrews 13:12. When Paul's writing a letter to Timothy, he says, now the overseer, which is a word for like a church leader, a local church leader, now the overseer is to be above reproach, faithful to his wife, temperate, self-controlled, respectable, and hospitable. Paul's saying when you're choosing leaders in the local church, when you're thinking about the kind of people who should lead a local church like this, one of the things that you need to look for in this life is hospitality. Oh, what I'm trying to show you with all these Bible verses, right? This is all over the Bible, right? Do you see what I'm trying to say? This isn't one verse. This isn't one person in one time. This is everywhere. All the writers of the New Testament are saying the same thing about hospitality. It's not just a one-off command. It's not just something for some people. Reaching out and welcoming people, including people, opening your home, going out of your way. This is a key part of who Jesus was and how he lived. It's a key part of the early church and how the first church lived and who they were. And we believe that it should be a key part of who we are today as people and the way that we live. Jesus went out of his way to welcome and include people. The early church followed his example, and we want to follow that example too. I'm being as frank as I can. We want to be a church that is open, that is welcoming, that is inclusive, and that is friendly to everyone. We want to be a church that is hospitable. And I'm not just talking about Sunday. I'm not just talking about how you are here. I'm talking about the way we are the church in our homes. I'm talking about the way we are the church in our families. I'm talking about what happens at our school and at our uni. I'm talking about the way we are with people at work. We want to be people who look for that kid who's left out at school. We want to be people who are the first to reach out to a new person when they're employed at our workplace. We want to reach out with friendship to the neighbours in our street. We want to be the person who invites that lonely elderly guy to share Christmas with our family because we know that otherwise he's sitting at home at home alone on Christmas Day. We want to invite that new immigrant family over to dinner and welcome them. That's why we've talked about, and we'll keep talking about, the power of invitation, right? Because hospitality always begins with an invitation, doesn't it? An invitation to an event, or maybe just an invitation to a conversation. We want to be people who make the first move. We want to be people who make the invitation. I mean, that's why we're doing this breakfast thing, right? That's what this breakfast thing is about next week, right? This isn't just giving you, a free meal. This is about creating an opportunity for you to invite people to. It's about creating a space where we can welcome people, welcome one another in the church here, but also welcome people into the community, connect with people, and just provide a space where people can feel hospitality. Because that's the way Jesus lived, right? It's the way the early church lived, and it's the way that we want to live. Now, I want to be really clear, especially in terms of like the breakfast next week. Hospitality isn't just a recruitment strategy. right? This isn't just me going, hey, if we're friendly to people, maybe they'll stay, right? That's not what this is about. Hospitality comes from the heart of God. Can you see that? Yeah. Paul said it this way. This is Romans 5:8, and some of you might have heard this, but maybe not quite thought about this in this way. God showed his great love for us by sending Christ to die for us while we were still sinners. God welcomes us while we're still sinners. In other words, while we're the ones who are messy. When we were failures, when we were kind of stinky, God went out of his way and welcomed us through Jesus. Hospitality is about us extending that same sense of welcome to other people while they're still failures, yeah? While they're kind of stinky. Hospitality is just about reflecting who God is to the world around us. That's what hospitality is about, right? It's not just about getting people into the church. Can you sort of see the difference? This is about showing people who God is like. That's what hospitality is about. Showing people who God is like. And this is also why, and I've got to make this point really, really carefully, this is why hospitality's for everyone. Right? This isn't just for people. There are people who are naturally outgoing, right? And they just, the kind of people, and they just talk to people wherever. This isn't about that. This isn't just for people who like to talk to people and like to be the life of the party. If you want to follow Jesus, the life that Jesus is leading you toward is a life of hospitality, because that's the way it's always been, because that's the way Jesus was, and it's the way that God is. So the question for those of us who follow Jesus, and if you're here this morning and you don't yet follow Jesus, you get a free pass on this. You can just sit back and relax. But for those of us who are at a point in our lives where we say, I want to follow Jesus, the question isn't, will I practice hospitality? The question is, how will I practice hospitality, right? The question is, what will hospitality look like in my life? So like for me and my family, we love food, right? Our dining table's the centre of our house. Food's a big thing for us. So hospitality for us almost always looks like a meal. And some of you know, like if we're getting together and we're eating food together. That's who we are. But that's not who everyone is, right? For some people, hospitality is about big groups and gathering big groups, putting on events and, making people feel just feel hospitality in a large group. For other people, hospitality is a one-on-one thing, right? I'm not a big group person. For me, it's about getting alongside someone. For some people, it's about meals and food. For some people, it's about events and experiences. For some people, it's just about sitting and listening and talking. What I want you to see today is that whatever it looks like for you, hospitality is not an option for a follower of Jesus. Hospitality has never been an option for a follower of Jesus. It's an absolute must, because it's who Jesus was. I've said before that nobody stumbles into community, right? I didn't stumble into community at that squash centre. I had to get invited in. I had to be welcomed in. I had to have people open the doors for me and then accept me and love on me when I was courageous enough to step through those doors. People don't stumble into community. They get invited by someone. They get invited by someone who's practicing hospitality. And as I've said before, you know this because this is how you got involved in stuff, because someone invited you into things. It's why most of you are here, because someone invited you to be here. And when you got here, you found this place, or when you got wherever you got into that community, you found that to be a hospitable place. Doesn't mean everyone was like you, doesn't mean everyone liked the things that you liked, but people were friendly and welcoming and created a space where you feel like you belong. That's why we stay anywhere that we stay, right? Hospitality is just asking you to pay it forward that thing that's been done for you in the first place, right? Everyone's desperate for a place to belong. All people. I don't care how young you are, how old you are, what culture you come from, how rich you are. Everyone needs a place to belong. People are hungry to find a place that they feel welcome, a place that feels a bit like home to them. People will do anything to find a community of people who will love them just for who they are, not for the stuff that they own. Who will want to be with them just because they want to be with them, not for the friends that they have and the brands that they wear and the car that they drive and the house that they live in. We all know that, right? Because we're exactly the same way. And I want to tell you, this kind of Christian hospitality is a powerful thing. In fact, and this seems like a weird thing for someone like me standing up, Christian hospitality is more powerful than the worship songs we sing. It's more powerful than the words that a preacher or someone like me says from the front here. It's even more powerful than the coffee we drink and the handmade biscuits that we eat. And you know this yourself. People will stay at a church with average worship. People will sit through boring teaching and preaching. People will even drink instant coffee as long as they feel welcomed and loved. Isn't that the truth? Yes. As long as they feel like they belong, they can suffer with all bunches of other stuff. But if they don't feel like they belong, it doesn't matter how awesome the band is. It doesn't matter how cool and funny and clever I am. Someone say amen. No, I'm kidding. Yeah. But it's true, isn't it? It doesn't matter how good all that other stuff is. If the church, and I don't mean just a Sunday morning gathering, if we as a community, if we as a people are not hospitable, none of the other stuff matters. I mean, it's like you can win an argument, right? And still lose the person. Hospitality isn't about, for a church, hospitality isn't about one person. It's not about a small group of people. This is about all of us. This is about who we are. It's about what we're trying to create here. It's about the people that we are trying to be. And when I say here, again, I want to be really clear. I'm not just talking about when we gather on Sunday morning. I'm talking about here as in this church, in this local community. What we're trying to be in schools here, what we're trying to be in workplaces here, what we're trying to be in neighbourhoods here. Hospitality is about the kind of church that we want to be, about the kind of people we want to be. And that's why hospitality is one of our core behaviours. That's why it makes that list of 6 things that we say, this is who we want to be as a church. And this series is about inviting you to be a part of that community with us. It's about inviting you into a place where hospitality will be part of who you are and part of who we are together. And that's who we are.